Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we're delving into the ongoing civil war in Sudan, where two rival factions of the armed forces are fighting for control of the country. The conflict has sparked mass displacement, worsened food insecurity, and drawn in rival powers seeking to bolster their influence in East Africa. We speak with Dr. Ken Opalo, a professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service focusing on issues of African power politics, East African affairs, and international political economy, about the war thus far and what could be ahead. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
So, Freddie, what's on the docket today?
So today we're going to get into recent US actions in Gaza to deliver humanitarian aid, as well as some US-Israeli diplomatic updates. And then we're going to have an update on Haiti as the Prime Minister resigns and the country spirals further into civil conflict. Finally, we'll turn to our conversation with Georgetown Professor Ken Opalo on the ongoing civil war in Sudan. So let's go to our first story in Gaza, where the US and its partners have begun constructing a floating pier off the coast of the territory in the Mediterranean Sea to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. Gaza is facing an immense and worsening lack of basic goods, including food, water, and medicine, amid Israel's continued campaign against Hamas. President Biden has been increasingly critical of Benjamin Netanyahu over recent months due to, among other things, his stymieing of aid deliveries by land. And last month, the administration announced the port plan, which would allow deliveries by sea that could bypass the land routes. The US has also begun airdropping food into Gaza in collaboration with a couple of other countries in the region. So, Kelly, what do these recent moves by Biden mean for Gaza amid the scale of food insecurity there? And what does this say about the relationship between the US and Israel?
So yeah, we've had a lot go on in the last couple of weeks with this. A lot of talk leading up to Ramadan was the hopes of a ceasefire. Beginning of Ramadan has come and gone, and ceasefire does not look like it's on the horizon right now, or some sort of temporary ceasefire to release some hostages and some Palestinian prisoners on the other side. That doesn't seem to be happening. The Israelis have not yet pushed their invasion into Rafah, which is a good thing. And just the other day said that they were going to send some folks here to the US to coordinate with the US on some plans and different ideas on moving into Rafah. The Biden administration, for its part, as you noted, has begun to become much more forceful, rhetorically at least, on pushing back against the Netanyahu government and being very direct. They don't want them to go into Rafah in a heavy-handed way. They want to see a plan. They want to get things moving towards an end game here. And then just at the end of last week, you had the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer come out with, very bold words, basically saying that Netanyahu had to step aside as the leader of Israel and that they needed to hold new elections. This is a very big move. I can't reiterate enough that that is a big deal. So that's where we are sort of on the political side of things. On the humanitarian side, you did note that these airdrops have been going on and have been started. It's obviously better than nothing, but the amount of aid you can get in through an airdrop is minuscule compared to the trucks or to ships. And, these are airdrops. So they're big packages of food on a pallet that's connected to a parachute and dropped out of the back of a plane. Obviously, these can only be so big. You can only fit so much on a plane compared to a ship or a semi-truck. And, it's important to remember these are airdrops. It's not like an airlift. So it's not like you're packing planes full of aid and landing at an airport and then getting stuff off the plane. And just to give you an idea on what an actual, by air, what it actually takes to do something like that, the Berlin airlift of 1948-49, where the US sent planes in after the Soviets closed off Berlin. We were landing an aircraft there at the height of the Berlin airlift over that winter of 48-49. The US was landing a plane at Tempelhof Airport every 45 seconds. So that's what you're talking about, to actually feed and give people the fuel that they need and everything like that. So, we're talking about 10 airdrops of, 10 planes of airdrops in the past few days. So the other plan that's come out now is providing aid by sea, and building a dock that will provide more aid, but we're looking at least a month or two until the dock actually gets built. So that's a long delay. A lot can happen between now and then. People need aid now. People will need aid in 2 months, yes, but they desperately need it today and as soon as we possibly can. And increasing and getting back up to the level of aid that was flowing through the trucks and the checkpoints is really the best move still moving forward. And that's what we need to be looking for going forward here.
Listeners should A, be very impressed by Kelly's knowledge of Cold War history, and B, I've just Googled, and the population of West Berlin in 1949 was the same as Gaza's is right now, which gives you a perspective on how much aid is needed and how much the US airlifts right now are really not enough.
That's a good on the spot check, because as I was putting out those numbers in my head, I was also thinking in my head, I wonder what the comparative population was between the two entities. So there you go, folks.
So, Kelly, you've been kind of following the issue for quite a lot of years, including in your previous career. And we've seen there are lots of news articles out right now about how successive US presidents have been a bit annoyed here and there behind the scenes with Israeli leadership over the last couple of decades. But this time we've seen, as you saw, Chuck Schumer come out in the open and say it. How much of a change is that?
I mean, I think it is a big change. And, we've seen, the US and Israel have had their moments going back decades. Obviously, the Eisenhower administration was furious with Israel, along with France and Great Britain during the Suez Crisis in 1956. And there's been issues over the years of difficulties in the relationship. It's a difficult relationship. It's not as it's made out to be in the news all the time. And the Obama administration obviously had a lot of frostiness with the Netanyahu government from '09 to 2017, because of settlement building in the West Bank and all that kind of stuff. But the level we're getting to today with, like, the senior most Jewish leader on the Hill, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, coming out and pushing for that kind of stuff. Again, rhetorically, these are big moves. Now, whether or not it changes US policy, that remains to be seen.
We'll keep an eye on it. For our last story, let's go to Haiti, where the country's already dire security and humanitarian situation has deteriorated even further in recent weeks. Haiti's embattled and unelected Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, announced last week that he would be stepping down amid threats by gang leaders to commit, quote, genocide and start a civil war if he remained in office. So international leaders around the region, from the United States to the Caribbean, are convening various stakeholders to form a transitional presidential council to rule the country until elections can be held. Another wrinkle in this situation is the Kenyan-led UN police mission, which until very recently looked ready to deploy and is now on hold until a government in Haiti can actually be there to receive it. So, Kelly, a lot has happened in the last few weeks since we covered this subject last. What's been going on?
Yes, it's quite shocking that we talked to folks on the podcast just a few weeks ago about this, but things have deteriorated even further in such a way that we felt that we needed to update folks even more. But, it really demonstrates, I think, just the level of power that these gangs have amassed over the course of the last months, but especially in the last few weeks. Mass attacks on infrastructure, completely shutting down the government, and really sort of holding sway over what may or may not happen on the island. So Henri, as we noted, has resigned at this point, still can't go back into Haiti. So at this point, also with the creation of this transitional council, there's a bunch of folks meeting, including Caribbean and U.S. leaders like Secretary Blinken, Caribbean heads of state, are meeting to talk about this transitional council and put people in place to run the government in the interim. But this is going to take a while. You've got Haitian political and civil society leaders trying to come up with a list of names that's tenable for and agreeable for everyone. You have a lot of the gang leaders that want some say in who's on this transitional council. And at the end of the day, you have to have a transitional government that's in place that the gangs are actually okay with. They don't have a formal sign off on this thing, but they have a de facto sign off, because just with Prime Minister Henri, they can, basically veto the government if they don't like who's put in place. So we're a long way from being in the clear in Haiti, and things could get a lot worse before they get better. But this is definitely a story we'll keep an eye on and keep folks updated on.
Certainly, we're in a vicious cycle where we can't have any kind of international or least of all Kenyan-led police mission until you have some semblance of government, but you can't have much of a semblance of a government until you have semblance of security, stability in the country, which is not looking too great right now.
So that ends our news roundup. And now we move to our conversation on Sudan and the most recent developments on that country's civil war with Ken Opalo. Dr. Opalo is an associate professor at the Georgetown University Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he focuses his research and teaching on political economy in Africa. He is also the author of the blog An Africanist Perspective, where he writes on African politics, economics, and history. Let's listen in to the conversation. We're happy to be joined today by Georgetown University Professor Ken Opalo to give us a little bit more of a breakdown on what's going on in Sudan. Ken, thanks, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. Looking forward to a conversation today.
So, let's start with a little bit of background for some folks. So, can you give us a little bit of the history of Sudan up until the ousting of dictator Omar al-Bashir in 2019?
So to understand the current conflict in Sudan, we need a little bit of history, as you suggest. Bashir came into power in 89 as part of a coup, which was part of the Salvation Front, basically a group of army officers who had allied with Islamists to take out an elected government in the 80s amidst economic crisis in the country. Bashir then proceeded to govern together with the Islamists until they fell out in the late 1990s, after which he basically had more of centralized rule, mostly governing through the military while prosecuting lots of wars within Sudan. So that's one quick aspect of how we got to 2019. The other sort of relevant aspect here is that Sudan as a country has a very complicated geography and economic history, which maps onto its own human geography and the politics or political economy of Sudan ever since its founding as a unitary state. So, like Egypt, which many of your listeners may be familiar with, Sudan is mostly desert, especially after South Sudan seceded, and has the Nile, which cuts through on towards the Egyptian border. And because of that, most of Sudanese people who depend on agriculture, mostly around the Nile. This historically produced a political economy which sort of has a core of the country in the Nile Valley, the riverine core, as it's commonly known, while the rest of the country, which is pretty huge, doesn't rely on agriculture, is mostly pastoral, is in drier parts of the country. And so for a long time throughout Sudanese history, the government has concentrated its economic planning and investments in the riverine core to the neglect of the peripheries. And over the years, the peripheries have rebelled against the center. So South Sudan rebelled against Khartoum. The Darfur conflicts that some of your listeners may be aware of was partially motivated by this sort of rebellion against the center. And then finally, a third dimension to Sudanese history is the question of religion and identity. The riverine core has historically been Muslim and Arab or Arabized. The peripheries have not always been Muslim or Arab or Arabized. And so, as part of the state building strategy of the Sudanese state, for the last 60 years or so, it's been more or less official policy to Islamize and Arabize as much of the country as possible. And different administrations have taken this to different degrees, right? So when Bashir was in cahoots with Islamists, he was very much in league with the idea of Islamizing the country, was not willing to compromise on South Sudan, which is majority Christian. But after he fell out with the Islamists, he relaxed the question of Islamization, and that partially made it possible for the governing elite to agree to South Sudanese independence. But the tension remains, right? This question of what's the identity of Sudan as a state? What sort of economic policy should it pursue? Should emphasis be on building dams and irrigation schemes and other development projects in the riverine core to the neglect of the periphery, or should the government, treat the whole country as one? And so it's a tragedy of both, individual choices of leaders, but also a consequence of Sudan's economic geography, as it were.
Yeah, it's interesting as you talk about that history. I actually did my doctoral dissertation on the US and Egypt in the 1950s, which is when, Sudan separated from Egypt and everything. So I cover earlier history dealing with Sudan in that. And it's also worth noting to our listeners too, some may already know the history of this, but Osama bin Laden actually lived in Sudan as a guest of Bashir during his Islamist days. So, can you walk us through a little bit then? Why in 2019, why was Bashir finally pushed out? And then, sort of, who came after? And then there's another coup in 2022 and different groups fighting each other. So, kind of, can you get us up to the last coup, I guess?
Yeah. So 2019 was a culmination of this sort of slow burning disaster. In 99, as I mentioned, Bashir cuts ties with the Islamists. Actually, Osama and bin Laden and the bombing of US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam play a role in this because after those bombings, Sudan essentially becomes a pariah state. However, there's a cast of characters within the administration who want to rebrand the country as non-Islamist sort of haven of development, mostly to attract Gulf cash to invest in the Sudanese economy, but also to open up the economy to broader investments. Around this same time, oil is coming online, mostly from South Sudan, so the country wants to rebrand, and I think that partially plays a role in Bashir throwing the Islamists under the bus in a sort of rebranding effort. Osama is kicked out, ends up in Afghanistan, etc. And so, as part of this strategy, right, Bashir has money now from oil, and he tries to make peace with South Sudan, which he did in 2005, while also prosecuting identity based wars in places like Darfur and other parts of the country. Now, to fight those wars, he needs armed men who can fight. He doesn't have the capacity to pay for all the wars. And so in Darfur, he subcontracts to Hemeti and friends, who at the time are known as the Janjaweed. They will become major players in a minute. The rest of the military is deployed to protect oil pipelines and mining installations in mostly South Sudan, but also in parts of the southeast. And so Bashir finds himself, fighting internal wars and needing to coup-proof against potential challenges within the military because the Islamists, having kicked them out of power, they were not fully neutralized, right? And so, as part of his coup-proofing strategies, he builds his centers of power within the military. The main Sudanese army, the SAF, you have the Janjaweed militia, which become the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, and he governs with a fractured semi-professional military, right? Standard coup-proofing strategies. South Sudan secedes, the money from gold dries out. They had 75% of the oil. He's running out of money. The economy that he had planned when oil started flowing, which was an economy, built on massive state projects and subsidies for agriculture and infrastructure, just doesn't work out, right? Because he doesn't have the cash to pay for it. And so, leading up to 2009, the Sudanese economy contracts by about 20%. The pound is devalued, people lose savings. Any Sudanese who can leave basically leaves. And this comes to a head in 2019 when there are massive protests all over the country to kick out the dictator. And I should note that, Sudan actually was part of the Arab Spring protests in 2011, but Bashir survived mostly because at the time he was still, swimming in money. Some of the oil money was still online. The gold money was still online. Um, but 2019 is the end of the road for him. And actually, what happens is that the two-headed monster that he had created, the regular military and the RSF, Hemeti and Al Burhan, come together to take him out. And so he's pushed aside by Hemeti and Al Burhan, who decide to govern together and try to cobble up a civilian administration. And for a brief window there was massive hope that civilian pressure could force the military to go back in the barracks and to allow for civilian control of the reform process. Those hopes were quickly dashed when it became clear that both Al Burhan and Hemeti were in power to stay. After the civilian question is resolved, they started jostling for power among themselves. And that's how we end up with the interim civilian administration being kicked out of power, and then the generals themselves falling out and starting the current civil war. early last year.
Yeah, and as you said, I remember the early days of this, and sort of, Bashir's finally gone after 30 some years, and maybe there was a ray of hope for Sudan moving forward, but ultimately you have these two military leaders trying to quote share power. That doesn't normally end up going well. So where are we at now with the war? What's happening on the ground? And does one side appear to have the upper hand, or is it just kind of stuck in a frozen conflict?
Yeah, so as of January, it seemed like the RSF had the upper hand. They were winning almost all the battles that they fought against the SAF. Hemeti went on this diplomatic charm offensive in the region. However, their momentum appears to have stalled. The latest fights in the north of Khartoum show that the SAF is regaining some of its lost momentum. They recaptured the National Broadcasting Corporation's headquarters, which I think is will be a morale boost.
Just to back up a second, so when they did have the falling out and they kicked out the civilian leadership in 2022, who's running the government? Is someone running the government, or is like basic bureaucracy just not happening in Sudan right now?
Yes, so for a brief moment, the basic bureaucracy stayed intact. But since the war started, the SAF ostensibly are the legitimate government, but that's only true for bits of the country that they control. The SAF actually was chased out of Khartoum, so now they're based in Port Sudan, meaning that whatever is left of the bureaucracy is mostly operating on the goodwill of individual bureaucrats and aid agencies and Sudanese community support groups. There have been the rise of some, self-defense militias, some allied to the two warring sides, some independent that are, basically holding up the state, as it were.
Yeah, and we've read things about potential famine, food insecurity that's happening in Sudan right now, disease outbreaks, things of that nature. So, and millions of internally displaced Sudanese. So, can you talk a little bit about the costs of the war so far from the human side and economic side?
Yeah, I mean the human toll is unfathomable, right? This is the biggest humanitarian crisis on the continent. Tens of thousands of people have died. 25 million plus are at risk of famine, right? More than last time I checked, about 6 to 8 million people internally displaced. The ongoing conflict means that it's hard to reach many of the needy people, right? It's not like Sudan already had great infrastructure, but the conflict destroyed a lot of the infrastructure. I don't think enough people appreciate the scale of the conflict. If you speak to most Sudanese, everyone always knew about the war in the south or the war in Darfur or the Nuba Mountains, but it's something that happened, far away. But to see the destruction of Khartoum is a big symbolic blow to Sudan. And so there's a very visible sort of breakdown of order in Khartoum and most parts of the country. The economic damage will take a long time to fix. And I think the human sort of side of it will take even longer, right? Because Sudan is basically involved in a fight for its identity. It's hard to see how this conflict ends without, say, a full defeat of one of the warring sides, because the nature of the conflict, how it's been prosecuted, suggests that peace between the two generals will be hard to achieve.
Yeah, and that kind of was going to be my next question here is sort of what's the end game? I don't see either one of these guys really just going away quietly unless defeated. Before we get to that though, there's another major reason as to why they can keep fighting is that there's some other countries involved in this as well. Can you sort of talk about the outside aid in terms of sort of military aid and things like that, financial aid, the SAF and the RSF are getting from outside groups?
Yes, so it's important to understand, the external dimension to this conflict, in part because it's what's keeping it going. It's hard to imagine the RSF mounting a formidable challenge as they have without external support. And so, there's a web of actors, most of it tied to broader Horn of Africa, Red Sea geopolitics. So it gets complicated very quickly. So on the RSF side, suggested support comes from Chad. Chad have ethnic groups that straddle the border between Chad and Sudan. RSF's base is in Darfur, which borders Chad. They've often used Chad as a rare base for their attacks. There are strong reasons for the Chadian administration to support the RSF. There's Libya, also supporting the RSF as a conduit for weapons, and the RSF has been implicated in supporting the Haftar factions in Libya, the Eastern Libyan rebel slash government. Bringing Chad and Libya together is alleged support from the UAE. The UAE is a major importer of Sudanese gold. Hemeti, head of the RSF, under Bashir, was the main honcho controlling the gold trade. The UAE is known to be supporting the Haftar side of the Libyan conflict, is also a major backer of the government of Chad. And because of that, the RSF also enjoys support from regional players who are also friendly with the UAE. So on the RSF side, the big linchpin here is the UAE, which sort of helps coordinate support from other governments in the region, both in terms of material support, but also diplomatically. And then on the SAF side, Egypt is a major backer. Egypt is wary of the destabilizing sort of nature of the RSF. You have, Saudi Arabia, who's been interested. You have Iran, rumored to be supporting the SAF because Iran is interested in setting up a military base, a naval base in Port Sudan. Similarly, Israel has been rumored to be supporting the SAF also because they're seen as the better actor in securing peace and security in the Red Sea. And so the SAF also is getting support from Gulf states that don't want instability in the wider region. And so all those factors combined mean that actual fighting, right, is not closely tied to experiences on the ground or the ability of the warring sides to tax the populations they govern and pay for the weapons they need to fight each other, right? Conflict has been totally abstracted from context.
Yeah, so there's lots of individual countries and groupings of countries that are playing a role in there, but what about where's the international community in this or the United States? And where do you kind of see this moving towards in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, the international community has been, missing in action, in part because, and by the international community here, I mostly mean the EU and the US. So the EU made their big bet on both Bashir and then later on the two generals to be sort of anchors of stability in the region. The EU was mostly interested in preventing migrants from transiting through Sudan into Europe. When that deal blew up in their face, they basically checked out. There have been some EU efforts towards humanitarian relief, but there's no serious push towards peace. On the American side, America has more or less, subordinated Sudan policy to pursuit of the Abraham Accords. And so, Sudan is nth on the list, where the list is very long with many other things in the Middle East right ahead of it. And so, as to the extent that Sudan is on the Middle East pile, it's way down the list, right? And the U.S. is close to the UAE and could, push the UAE to sort of stop its support for the RSF and force a negotiated settlement. But it's not going to because the UAE has leverage vis-a-vis, the wider sort of Middle East regional geopolitics, which puts Sudanese right in a pretty tough spot. I think the one sort of ray of hope would be if, for whatever reason, right, the RSF falters in its internal military capacity, which then, convinces Abu Dhabi that they are a bad bet and therefore allows the SAF to gain momentum and recapture a good chunk of the core as a basis for projecting legitimacy and some form of reconstruction. But even in that scenario, right, I think the RSF has the capacity to just go back to Darfur and cause trouble from the periphery for a very long time. Right. So as long as they have access to money and, the war economies of the wider Sahel, right, going from Chad, Sudan, Libya, and elsewhere, they will be in the game of being able to cause trouble for Khartoum. The only way out is for the RSF to lose momentum. It's hard to see how they gain momentum and go all the way to Port Sudan without sort of concerted effort by the UAE and other allies in the region. So, absent them getting pushed back to Darfur, we're likely to see a stalemate. The other ray of hope here, which would be unfortunate for the Chadians, is if Chad has a coup which brings in an administration that has a different view on the RSF and therefore forces the RSF to stop using Chad as a rare base and therefore weakens the ability to wage war within Sudan. That could be another sort of source of shift in the conflict.
All right. Well, we will definitely be watching for that, and may have you back on in a few months to give us an update on what's going on with this. So, Professor Ken Opalo from Georgetown University, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and hopefully this gets resolved soon, sooner rather than later, for the sake of the Sudanese.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you again to Ken for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett Dang. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.